Case of Jennie Brice by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Read by Ghosty Keys. Chapter 5. Mr. Reynolds did not come home for dinner after all. The water had got into the basement at the store, and he telephoned, one of the floodgates in the sewer having leaked, and they had to move some of the departments to the upper floor. I had expected to have him in the house this evening, and now I was alone. But as it happened, I ended up not being alone. Mr. Graves, one of the city's detectives, came at 6:30 and went carefully over the Ladleys' room. I showed him the towel and the slipper and the broken knife where we had found the knife blade. But he was very non-committal, and he left in a half an hour, taking the articles with him in a newspaper. So I was alone again. At 7, the doorbell rang, and I went as far as I could on the staircase, with it still being flooded, and I saw a boat outside the door. I saw a boatman and a woman on the boat, and I called to them to bring the boat back along the hall. I had this queer feeling that it might be Mrs. Ladley, and that I'd been making a fool of myself all day for nothing. But it was not Mrs. Ladley. Is this number 42? Yes. Does Mr. Ladley live here? Yes, but he's not here now. Are you Mrs. Pittock? Pittman, yes. The boat bumped against the stairs and the woman got out. She was as tall as Mrs. Ladley, and when I saw her in the light from the upper hall, I knew her instantly. It was Temple Hope, the leading woman of the Liberty Theater. I would like to talk to you, Mrs. Pittman. Where can we go? So I led the way to my room, and she followed me in, and then she turned and shut the door. Now then. Without any other preliminary, she led in. Where is Jennie Brice? Well, I don't know, Miss Hope, I answered. We looked at each other for a minute, and each of us saw what the other suspected. He's killed her, she exclaimed. She was afraid he would do it, and he has. Yep. Killed her and thrown her in the river, I said. That's what I think, and he'll go free at that. Seems there isn't a murder if there isn't a corpse. Nonsense. If he's done that, the river will give her up, eventually. But the river doesn't always give them up, I retorted. Not in flood time, anyhow. Or when they are found, 4 months later, you can't prove anything. She had only a little time, being due at the theater soon, but she sat down and told me the story she had told afterwards on the witness stand. She had known Jennie Brice for years, they having been together in a chorus long ago in Nadia. She was married then to a fellow on the vaudeville circuit, Miss Hope said. He left her about that time, and she took up with Ladley. I don't think they were ever married. What? I said, jumping to my feet. And they came to my respectable house like this? There's never been a breath of scandal about this house. Miss Hope, if this comes out, I'm ruined. Well, perhaps they were married, she said. Anyhow, they were always quarreling, and when he wasn't playing, it was worse. She used to come to my hotel and cry her eyes out. I know you were friends, I said. Almost the last thing she said to me was about the black and white dress of hers that you were to borrow for the piece this week. Black and white dress? Me? Borrow one of Jennie Brice's dresses, exclaimed Miss Hope. I should think not. I have plenty of my own. And that puzzled me. For she had said it, and that was sure. And then I remembered that I had not seen the dress in the room that day. When I went in to look for it, it was gone. I came back and told Miss Hope. A black and white dress? Did it have a red collar? Yes. Then I remember it. She wore a small black hat with a red quill in that dress. You might look for the hat. Well, she followed me back to the room, and she stood in the doorway while I searched. But the hat was gone too. Perhaps after all, he's telling the truth. Her fur coat isn't in the closet, is it? And it was gone. It is strange that all day I had never thought of looking over her clothes and seeing what was missing. Thanks, Nemnog. I hadn't known all she had, of course, but I had seen her all winter in her fur coat and I had admired it. It was a striped fur, brown and gray, very unusual. But with the coat missing, and the dress gone, and the hat gone, it began to look as if I had been making a fool of myself and stirring up a tempest in a teacup. Mrs. Hope was as puzzled as I. She looked up and said, "Anyhow, if he didn't kill her, it isn't because he didn't want to. Only last week she had hysterics in my dressing room and said he had threatened to poison her. It was all Mr. Bronson, their business manager. And I could do to quiet her." She looked at her watch and exclaimed that she was late and would have to hurry, and so I saw her down to the boat. The river had now been falling rapidly for the last hour or two, and I heard the boat scrape as it went over the door sill. I did not know whether to be glad that the water was going down, or if I could live like a normal person again, or now to be sorry for fear of what we might find in the mud that was always left behind. Well, Peter was lying where I had put him, on a folded blanket laid in a clothes basket. And so I went down to him and sat down beside the basket. Peter. Poor old Peter. Who did this to you? Who hurt you? He looked at me and whined. He wanted to tell me, if only he could. Was it Mr. Ladley? I asked, and the poor thing cowered close to his bed and shivered. I wondered if it had been he, and if it had, why he had come back. Perhaps he had remembered the towel. Perhaps he would come again and spend the night there. I was like Peter. I shivered at the very thought. At 9 o'clock I heard a boat at the door. It had stuck there, and its occupant was scolding furiously at the boatman. Soon after I heard splashing, and I knew that whoever it was wading back to the stair through the 1.5 foot of water still in the hall. I ran back to my room and locked myself in, and then stood, armed with a stove lid lifter, in case it should be Ladley, and he should try to break the door in. The steps came. Peter began barking furiously, and it seemed to me that this was to be my end, killed like a rat in a trap and thrown out the window to float like my kitchen chair into Molly Maguire's kitchen, or to be found lying in the ooze of the yard after the river went down. The steps hesitated at the top of the stairs, and turning back along the hall, Peter redoubled his noise. He never barked for Mr. Reynolds or the Ladleys. I stood still, hardly able to breathe. The door was thin and the lock loose. One good blow and the doorknob turned and I screamed. And that is all I do remember until I came to. Half an hour later, and saw Mr. Holcomb stooping over me. The door with the lock broken was standing open. I tried to move and saw that my feet were propped up on the edge of Peter's basket. "You'd better leave them up," Mr. Holcomb said. "It sends the blood back to the head. Half the damn fool people in the world stick a pillow under a fainting woman's shoulders. And that's the worst thing ever. How are you now?" "All right," I said feebly. "I thought you were Mr. Ladley." He helped me up, and I sat in a chair and tried to keep my lips from shaking. And then I saw that Mr. Holcomb had brought a suitcase with him and had set it inside the door. "Don't worry, Ladley's safe, at least until he gets bail. They've picked him up. He was boarding a Pennsylvania train bound east." "For murder?" "No, only as a suspicious character. But that does as well as anything for the time." He sat down opposite me and looked at me intently. "Mrs. Pittman, did you ever hear the story of the horse that wandered out of the village and couldn't be found?" I shook my head. "Well, the best wit of the village failed to locate the horse. But one day the village idiot walked to town and he was leading the missing animal by the bridle. They asked him how he had done it. And he said, 'Well, I just thought, what would I do if I was a horse? And then I went and did it.'" "I see," I said, humoring him. "No, you don't see. Now, what are we trying to do?" "We're trying to find a body. Do you intend to become a corpse?" He leaned over and tapped on the table between us. "We are trying to prove a crime. And I intend for the time to become a criminal." He looked so curious, bent forward and glaring at me from under his bushy eyebrows. With his shoes on his knee, he had taken them off to wade to the stairs, and his trousers were rolled to his knees. I began to wonder if he was entirely sane. But Mr. Holcomb, eccentric as he is sane enough. Not really a criminal. As really as lies in me. "Listen, Mrs. Pittman, I want to put myself in Ladley's place for a day or two. Live as he lived. Do what he did. even think as he thought, if I can. I'm going to sleep in his room tonight with your permission. Well, I could not see any reason for objecting, although I thought it silly and rather useless, but I led the way to the front room, Mr. Holcomb following with his shoes and his suitcase. I lit the lamp and he stood looking around him. I see you have been in here since we left this afternoon. Twice, I replied. First with Mr. Graves and later... The words died on my tongue. Someone had been in the room since my last visit. He has been here, I gasped. I left the room in tolerable order. Look at it. When were you here last? 7:30 or thereabouts. Where were you in between 7:30 and 8:30? Well, I was in the kitchen with Peter. I told him about the dog and about finding him shut in the room. The washstand was pulled out. The sheets of Mr. Ladley's manuscript, usually in an orderly pile, were half on the floor. Bed coverings had been jerked off and flung over the back chair. Peter, imprisoned, might have moved the washstand and upset the manuscript. But Peter would never have put the bedclothing over the chair. Or broken his own leg. He said, getting out his notebook, and he made an exact memorandum of what I had just told him, and the condition of the room. That done, he turned to me. Mrs. Pittman, I'll thank you to call me Mr. Ladley for the next day or so. I'm an actor out of employment, 41 years of age, short, stout, and bald, married to a woman I would like to be quit of. And I'm writing a play in which the Schuberts intend to star me in, or at least in which I intend the Schuberts to star me in. Okay, very well, Mr. Ladley, I said, trying to enter into the spirit of the thing, and God knows, seeing no humor in it. Then I guess you'll like your soda from the icebox. Soda for what? For your whiskey and soda, before you go to bed, sir. Oh, certainly. Yes, bring the soda. And just a moment, Mr. Pittman. Just so we're straight. Mr. Holcomb is always a total abstainer, and has always been so. So it is Ladley, not Holcomb, who's going to drink this abominable stuff. Well, I said I quite understood, but that Mr. Ladley could skip a night if he so wished. But the gentleman would not hear of it, and so when I brought the soda, he poured himself a double portion. He stood looking at it with his face screwed up as if the very odor revolted him. Chances are, he said, that Ladley, that I, having a nasty piece of work to do tonight, might drink a larger amount than normal. And he raised the glass only to put it down. Don't forget, he said, to put the large knife where you left it last night on the stand. I'm sorry the water has gone down, but I shall imagine it at the 7th step. Good night, Mrs. Pittman. Good night, Mr. Ladley, I said, smiling. And remember, you're 3 weeks arrears on your rent. Well, I went out and heard him close the door behind me. And then through the door I heard a great sputtering and coughing and knew he had got the whiskey down somehow. I put the knife out as he had asked me to and went to bed. By now I was ready to drop. Not even the knowledge that an imaginary Mr. Ladley was about to commit an imaginary crime in my house could keep me awake. Mr. Reynolds came in at 11 o'clock. I was roused when he banged his door, but that was all I knew till morning. When the sun on my face finally wakened me, Peter in his basket lifted his head as I moved and thumped his tail against his pillow in greeting. So I put on a wrapper and called Mr. Reynolds by knocking at his door, and then I went into the front room. The door was closed, but somebody was groaning. So I opened the door and I looked in, but my heart stood still and raced. Mr. Holcomb was on the bed, fully dressed. He had a wet towel tied around his head, and his face was swollen and puffy. He opened one eye and looked at me. What a night! What happened? What did you find? Find? Find nothing, except that there was something wrong with that whiskey. It's poisoned me. I haven't even been out of the house. So for that day at least, Mr. Ladley became Mr. Holcomb once more, and as such accepted ice in massive quantities, a mustard plaster over his stomach, and considerable nursing by me. By evening he was better, but although he clearly intended to stay on and stick this through, he said nothing about changing his identity again, and I was glad enough. The very name Ladley was horrible to me now. The river went down almost entirely that day, and although there was still considerable water in the cellars, it takes time to get rid of that, but the lower floors showed us nothing suspicious. The papers were ruined, of course, and the doors were warped and sprung, and the floors coated with mud and debris. My friend Terry came that afternoon, and together we worked, and we hung the dining room rug out to dry in the sun. As I was coming in, I looked over at the McGuire yard across the way, and Molly McGuire was there, and all of her children around her gaping. Molly was hanging out to dry a sodden fur coat that had once been striped, brown and gray. I went over after breakfast and claimed the coat belonged to Mrs. Ladley, but she refused to give it up. There's sort of an unwritten rule concerning salvage of flood articles, and I had to leave the coat. I had my kitchen chair after all, but it was Mrs. Ladley's coat, beyond doubt. And I shuddered when I thought how it had probably got into the water. And yet it was curious too, for if she had it on, how did it get loose and go floating around Molly McGuire's yard? And if she had worn it, how did it get into the water? right. And that's chapter